The restaurant buzzed with the hum of low conversations, the clinking of fine glassware, and the distant melody of a live piano. Golden chandeliers cast a warm glow, bouncing off the polished marble floors. It was the kind of place where elegance wasn't just expected, it was demanded. And sitting at the center of it all in his perfectly tailored suit, James Carter looked like he belonged. He leaned back in his chair, his arm draped casually around Clara, the stunning woman beside him. She laughed, her delicate fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass, her diamond bracelet catching the light. They were celebrating. A new business deal, another million secured, another step toward untouchable wealth. James smirked, lifting his glass to hers. Life was exactly as it should be. Or at least, that's what he thought, until he glanced across the room. His breath caught. His fingers froze around the glass. Behind the counter, dressed in a simple, worn-out uniform, her hair tied in a loose bun, was Samantha, his ex-wife. For a moment, he doubted his own eyes. What was she doing here? She was supposed to be gone, out of his world, erased from his life like a bad investment. But here she was, moving between tables, clearing plates, taking orders, as if she belonged in a place like this. And then, his gaze dropped. The soft curve of her belly was unmistakable. She was pregnant. James felt the ground shift beneath him. His grip on the glass tightened, his heart hammering against his ribs. How? Who? James. Clara's voice pulled him back. Her manicured fingers touched his hand, her brows furrowed. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. James forced a smirk, shaking his head. Just thought I saw someone I knew. But his eyes betrayed him, flicking back to Samantha. And this time, she looked up. Their eyes met. And in that single fleeting second, everything changed. Samantha's expression barely flickered, but James could see the brief flash of shock, pain, and something else. Something unreadable in her eyes. She quickly looked away, pretending not to have seen him, but James knew better. She had felt that moment just as intensely as he had. His mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding at once. How was this possible? The last time he had seen her, she was walking out of his life, defeated but still holding on to her pride. He'd convinced himself she was fine, maybe struggling, but moving forward. Yet here she was, in a cheap restaurant uniform, waiting tables, pregnant. The realization hit like a gut punch. The baby. Was it? Clara's voice snapped him back. James, you're acting weird. Who is she? James exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around his whiskey glass. He needed to shut this down. No one, he said flatly. A lie. Clara arched a brow, clearly unconvinced. But before she could pry further, a waiter arrived, placing their plates down, with a well-rehearsed smile. The moment passed, at least for Clara. Not for James. His appetite was gone. His mind was already across the room, where Samantha moved mechanically, clearing plates, refilling glasses, ignoring his existence. She was thin, tired-looking, but still strong. The same quiet strength that had once made him believe she was unbreakable. But he had broken her, hadn't he? The weight of regret pressed against his chest, but he pushed it down. Now wasn't the time. He needed answers, and he wasn't leaving without them. James threw his napkin onto the table and stood abruptly. I need a moment, he muttered, not waiting for Clara's response. As he strode toward the counter, Samantha's back was turned, but he saw the way her shoulders tensed. She knew he was coming. Samantha, he said, his voice controlled but firm. She stilled but didn't turn. I'm working, James. This isn't the time. I don't care, he said, his eyes flicking down to her stomach. He couldn't pretend not to see it. We need to talk, now. Finally, she faced him, and when she did, her eyes were blazing. Not with sadness, with fire. That's none of your business, she said coldly. You lost the right to ask anything about my life. James wasn't used to being shut down, especially not by her, but before he could argue, a customer called her name, and just like that, she was gone. leaving James standing there with a million questions and a growing storm of emotions he didn't know how to handle. James returned to the table, but everything felt off. The luxury of the restaurant, the expensive wine, the soft glow of chandeliers, it all felt meaningless. Across from him, Clara was speaking, but her words blurred into the background noise of clinking glasses and distant laughter. His mind was somewhere else. With her. With Samantha. With the past he thought he had buried. Clara sighed, crossing her arms. "Are you going to tell me what's going on, or do I have to guess?" James looked at her, then at his untouched plate. He could lie again, tell her it was nothing, that he was just tired. But what was the point? He downed the last of his whiskey, the burn doing nothing to clear the tightness in his chest. "I'll take care of the bill," he said, standing abruptly. "I have something to handle." Clara scoffed, her frustration barely contained. "Seriously? You're just leaving?" James wasn't in the mood for a scene. He leaned down, placing a quick kiss on her cheek, the same effortless charm he used in business deals. "I'll call you later." He wouldn't. As he stepped outside, the night air hit him, cool and crisp, but it did nothing to settle the storm raging inside him. Samantha was here, working late shifts, pregnant, and he hadn't known a damn thing. Pulling out his phone, he scrolled to a contact he hadn't dialed in months. Liam. His best friend, his lawyer, the one person who always had a clear head when James didn't. Liam answered after a few rings, his voice casual. "James, haven't heard from you in a while. What's up?" James exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I need you to find out everything about Samantha, where she's been, how she's been living, and if the baby is mine." There was a beat of silence before Liam spoke again, this time slower. "James, are you sure you want to open that door?" James clenched his jaw. He had never been more sure of anything in his life. "I need to know." Because if that child was his, everything was about to change. The next morning, James sat in his high-rise office, but his mind was miles away. The skyline stretched before him, tall buildings, endless traffic, a city that never stopped moving. Yet, for the first time in years, he felt stuck. A thick file sat on his desk, freshly delivered by Liam. Samantha Bennett. Employment history, current address, financial records. James hesitated before opening it, his pulse tightening. He had faced billion-dollar negotiations without flinching, but this felt different. His fingers flipped through the pages. She lived in a cramped apartment on the lower side of town, a one-bedroom unit, barely enough space for one person, let alone a baby. She worked double shifts at the restaurant, barely making ends meet. The image of Samantha clearing tables, exhaustion in her eyes, her stomach round with his child, it hit him again, harder this time. She had been doing this alone. James shut the file abruptly, his jaw tightening. He had given her nothing, not a dime, not a call, nothing. A sharp knock on the door snapped him out of it. Liam stepped in, dressed sharply as always, holding 2 coffee cups. He set one down in front of James before taking a seat. "So?" he asked. "What are you going to do?" James stared at the file for a long moment before speaking. "I need to see her." Liam leaned back, crossing his arms. "James, be honest with yourself. Are you doing this because you care or because your ego can't handle that she moved on without you?" James hated how well Liam could see through him. He exhaled slowly. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know one thing. If that baby is mine, I won't let her struggle alone." Liam studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then don't screw this up." James didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed his car keys, his mind already set. It was time to get the truth, no matter what it cost him. The drive to Samantha's apartment felt longer than it should have. James gripped the steering wheel, his jaw tight, his mind tangled with emotions he didn't want to face. Regret, guilt, something deeper he wasn't ready to name. The streets changed as he left the towering glass buildings behind, replaced by older brick apartments, dim streetlights flickering overhead. This wasn't the world he lived in, but it was the world Samantha had been surviving in. He pulled up in front of a small run-down complex. The paint was peeling, the stairwell dimly lit. This is where she's been living? He felt something twist inside him. Anger. Shame. He had spent the last 6 months dining at the finest restaurants, flying across the world for meetings, sleeping in silk sheets, while Samantha, the woman he once swore to protect, was here, pregnant, alone. He got out of the car, his heart beat loud in his ears. Would she even let him in? Would she even listen? Reaching her door, he knocked firmly. A moment passed, then another. Finally, the door creaked open, and there she was. Samantha stood in an oversized sweater, her hair pulled back messily, exhaustion clinging to her features. But despite the dark circles under her eyes, there was a fire in them, a strength that made James hesitate. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The past, the silence, the years, they all hung between them like a wall too thick to break. Then Samantha's grip on the door tightened. "What are you doing here, James?" Her voice wasn't soft. It wasn't welcoming. It was cold, guarded. James swallowed hard. "We need to talk." Samantha let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "No, James, we don't." She started to close the door, but James caught it with his hand, desperation creeping into his voice. "Samantha, wait." Her eyes flashed. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to disappear, move on with your life, and then show up when it's convenient for you." James clenched his jaw. He deserved that. Every word. But still, he had to push forward. "The baby," he said, his voice low. "Is it mine?" Samantha stiffened, and in that instant, he knew the truth. She didn't have to say it. She didn't have to answer. The silence was enough. Samantha's fingers tightened around the edge of the door, her knuckles turning white. James could see the conflict in her eyes, the way she wanted to slam the door in his face, but at the same time, a storm of emotions was brewing beneath the surface. He swallowed hard, stepping closer. "Samantha, just tell me the truth." She let out a shaky breath, her jaw tightening. Then, finally, she spoke. "Yes, James. The baby is yours." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had prepared himself for this, convinced himself that he already knew the answer, but hearing it out loud, it changed everything. His mind spun. How had he let it come to this? How had he let her struggle alone, working herself to exhaustion while carrying his child? Samantha's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp and cold. "Now that you have your answer, you can leave." James's brows furrowed. "I'm not leaving." She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, really? That's rich coming from you. Where were you all these months, James? Where were you when I had no money for doctor visits? When I was so sick I could barely stand? When I wondered if I'd even have a place to bring this baby home to?" James felt something twist deep inside him. Guilt, shame, regret. He had no defense, no excuse. He had been gone. "I didn't know," he said, his voice quieter this time. Samantha's eyes flashed with anger. "Because you never cared enough to ask." James exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" she shot back. "You were too busy living your perfect life, with your new girlfriend, your $1 million deals, your perfect little world. And now you show up here thinking what, that you can just waltz back in and fix everything?" James didn't know what to say. For the first time in his life, he was speechless. Samantha let out a shaky breath, glancing back into the apartment. "I don't need you, James. I've done this on my own. I'll keep doing it on my own." James took a deep breath, stepping forward. "But you shouldn't have to." She froze. His voice was steady now, his gaze locked onto hers. "I know I screwed up. I know I let you down. But this isn't just about us anymore. That's my child, Samantha. And whether you like it or not, I'm not walking away this time." Samantha's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to argue. But the fire in her eyes flickered for just a second, and James saw it. The exhaustion, the weight she had been carrying alone. She didn't say anything. She didn't slam the door. For James, that was enough. For now. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken words. James could see the battle in Samantha's eyes, the instinct to push him away, to protect herself from more disappointment, but beneath it, there was something else. Exhaustion, fear, and maybe, just maybe, a small part of her that still wanted to believe him. Samantha crossed her arms over her stomach, her voice quieter now. "What do you want, James?" James exhaled, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was his chance, maybe his only one. He couldn't afford to say the wrong thing. "I want to help," he said honestly. "I want to be there, for you, for the baby. I know I don't deserve that chance, but I'm asking for it anyway." Samantha let out a soft, bitter laugh. "You think it's that easy? That showing up now erases everything?" "No," James admitted. "I don't." He took a careful step closer, lowering his voice. "But I know what it's like to grow up without a father. I don't want my child to go through that, and I don't want you to go through this alone." Samantha looked away, blinking rapidly. He knew she hated showing vulnerability, hated letting her guard down, but he could see the walls starting to crack. A sudden kick from the baby made her inhale sharply, her hands instinctively moving to her belly. James's gaze followed, his chest tightening. "Can I—" His voice was barely above a whisper. She hesitated. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, she nodded. James reached out, his hand resting gently against her stomach. And then he felt it, a tiny movement, his child. His heartbeat stuttered, his throat tightening. For months he had been blind, distant. But now, everything felt real. Samantha wiped at her eyes quickly, clearing her throat. "I don't trust you, James, not yet." "I know," he said softly, "but I'll earn it." She held his gaze for a long moment, and then finally, she stepped aside, just enough for him to enter. James walked in, closing the door behind him. This wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a beginning,